Welcome everyone. We're very delighted to be talking about the Boston Globe for the second straight month. What are you guys going to talk about next month?
How to rebuild Boston.com. How's that?
All right.
Please, we're taking suggestions. My name's Adam Salzman. I'm the manager of web development at Boston.com and Boston Globe. We've got two awesome front-end devs who are going to talk to you guys tonight about some of the challenges, overcoming some of those challenges, and some future-proofing around the responsive design stuff that we did, and a few other things. And then we've got our engineers, Ian and Kaz, who are going to discuss MySafe and the requirement that everyone in Boston use Erlang for everything. That's partial truth. This project is about everything we've seen, whether it succeeds or fails, has done some absolutely amazing things and made people rethink the way to put content up there. We couldn't do it without an amazing team, and I'm not going to lie, I'd like to warm myself up for a moment and just applaud everyone. Dan Middleton, who you meet in a moment, and Jesse Weisbeck, as well as in the back, we've got Dave Parsons, Trey Eccles, and then Kaz Von Cow, I'm sure everyone in Boston knows, and Ian Cohen.
And Fran.
Well, all right, and Francisco Diaz, who almost single-handedly kept Boston.com up while all of our other resources were on the Boston Globe site. That being said, we are also hiring. We're looking for another CMS developer. If you like Java and the JSTL, let us know. You can send me your resume at adam@boston.com. And with that, Jesse, Dan, give us your best smiles.
Hey guys, I'm Dan Middleton. Before I start, I just want to get a broad sense of who we have in the room. So if you identify with the title designer, throw your hand up. Or if you designer and developer. All right, so cool. We can talk about JavaScript and you won't go, "Wow." Awesome. It's not going to be too intensive, right? We're going to give you a broad overview of what we did to get BostonGlobe.com to where it is today. If you want to grab these slides, that's the short URL. You can attack that whenever you feel like it.
Oh, now they can.
Oh. Why not? Oh, because I moved out of the way. I'll wait.
F, capital T.
So we'll come back to that at the end of the presentation. If you didn't get it right now, because it's about to go away. So today, Jesse and I are going to talk briefly about the JavaScript architecture that went into building the BostonGlobe.com. I should make note now that that architecture isn't specific to our site, but it does give you some best practices, not only in responsive design, but also best practices in general web development. We also want to step through a few of the challenges that we came across when you're building a production environment versus building a responsive portfolio site, right? There's going to be some major differences that you're going to need to overcome. And then we want to just step through quickly some future considerations. And this maybe is where you guys, as developers, would have some feedback for us on how to make things better, or some ideas that you're using now that maybe we could implement in what we're doing. And the talk isn't going to be so much about media queries and CSS and that kind of stuff, because you can use Google, or you can get Ethan Marcotte's book and you can read that. We want to talk more about some stuff that happens when you're really building for a major news organization like we did. So yeah, Jesse's going to jump in here and
Thanks. Again, I'm Jesse Weisbeck. I hold the title of front-end web developer at the Globe. Everything Dan said so far is true. And I would just, again, give Ethan another plug for his book, Responsive Web Design, if you don't have it. The techniques outlined in that book are actually fairly close to what we used for the CSS and HTML on this site, so that's a great resource. Okay, so the brief issue of the front end, like a really broad view, is just to kind of give you a little bit of background. The Filament Group, a local shop, and Ethan Marcotte, they were both involved in helping us kind of get static prototypes of the HTML, CSS, some of the JavaScript ready. And they passed that on to us. And it's our job to kind of massage that, change it, modify it, and get it into the CMS. And one of the key things I want to talk about a little bit is kind of the JavaScript framework, because that's really the heart of what I think kind of makes a site like this possible, I guess. Of course, you know, media queries are really important, but when you build a responsive website, you get involved in, you know, building a site that needs to work on a range of devices. There are other considerations. So there's a JavaScript framework that does three basic things. It does some testing. It figures out, like, is this browser enhanced? Is it basic? Those are the categories we use. And I'll go into that a little bit. It also kind of manages a library of scripts and CSS, and kind of enables packaging those based on classes that are drawn on the body tag. So it does that. The last thing it also does is loads the scripts into the document head. So I'll go into a little bit now about how that basically works. So when you request a page from bostonglobe.com, the first thing you're going to get in the source code is what we kind of call a basic experience. So there's a basic CSS, and there's a basic kind of, I guess, list of JavaScript that you're going to get. And if your device doesn't support JavaScript, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a site rendered with those kind of defaults. And it's only after that last file, globecontroller.js fires, that we start to get into, like, testing your browser and enhancing the experience. So this is kind of the first layer of kind of, you know, if you want to use responsive in a broad sense, I mean, you could say that it's already kind of, you know, kind of being responsive in a sense. But I guess the other term maybe that's appropriate too is progressive enhancement. So Filament Group that I mentioned before, they're really big into progressive enhancement. They've written a book about it. They're pretty involved in some projects around that stuff as well. So right, so you basically get this basic experience if you don't support any JS. So an example would be like BlackBerry OS 4. It's a fairly old browser. That one gets, like, the most basic experience of all. Right, so it also loads up a couple JavaScripts that are needed. So responsive images, respond.js does some work around media queries. There's a few polyfills, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few more slides. So the heart of this JavaScript framework that runs things is basically this controller script. And it does all the orchestration around how good is your browser, and then it figures out what to deliver based on what page you're on. So, it kind of drives the progressive enhancement that I kind of mentioned earlier. And that actually couples really well with responsive web design, because, like I said a minute ago, if you're going to build a site that's going to work across a range of devices, progressive enhancement becomes really important. So the tenets of that also apply. Now there's a few other JavaScript files that are involved in this framework, but I'll just kind of show you some simplified code that kind of steps you through what's going on here. So the first thing that's important is that this is the series of tests that it runs. And you can see it's really not that complicated, but it does a good job of kind of determining whether your browser is going to get kind of an enhanced suite, an enhanced experience, or whether it's going to retain kind of the basic experience. And the flag here, media query support, this is provided by respond.js, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And that's a really interesting flag right there, because we basically are saying if you support media queries, you're probably a pretty good modern browser. So we're going to flag you as enhanced. And then we have these other flags. If you're IE 6, 7, or 8, we're also going to give you the enhanced, even if you're IE 6. So we want to be as fair as possible, even to some of the older browsers. And where those flags come from, they come from conditional comments in the head. Those aren't sniffed from the user agent string. So that's an important note. There's, like, no UA sniffing going on anywhere on the site. That's not quite true for some of the ads that are pulled in. They might do some of that, but we don't do any of it. Right, so after that, it asks if you're enhanced. If you're not, you're just returned out of there and you remain at the basic experience. If you are enhanced, then the next thing we do is we remove that basic experience out, and then we get on to actually loading in an enhanced experience. So this is another part of the script. It takes an inventory of all the assets, basically throws all the scripts possible into an array. So there's libraries, there's stuff that's specific to the globe. They'll run on like individual pages or groups of pages, and then there's also CSS. So you might see here that jQuery is something that's actually loaded. So jQuery is not loaded by default. And again, progressive enhancement comes into play here. We want to make sure that devices that are going to kind of choke on jQuery don't ever get that. Right. So the next thing we need to do basically is kind of get a context. And what I mean by that is figure out, we need to tell the script where you are on the site so that it knows which scripts to package up for you. This function, body ready, is kind of a special function. It waits for a JavaScript property called body, so there's a property called document.body. It waits for that to load, and then as soon as it's loaded, it'll fire off the rest of this stuff. So what it's doing is it's waiting for the body, because what happens inside here is manipulating the DOM, it's changing the markup. So we kind of rolled our own kind of body ready function. And if you work with jQuery at all, you know there's kind of a built-in function you can just use for that. That's kind of this is the one that we use here. It's simple, but it works pretty well. So what's basically happening in this script is we're listing out all the possible template types and sections that exist on the site. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab the classes off the body tag, and we're going to loop through all that and say, do any of these match the template types or sections out of the array of template types and sections? And then once we figure out where they match, then we store that in a property, this property right here, template type or section. And then at that point, we pretty much know where you are. And the next thing we need to do then is get on with the business of sort of delivering the scripts that are appropriate to you for that page. And I picked a couple examples here of kind of conditional loading of scripts. And again, just to back up for a second, I say this is really important because we don't want to deliver, more JavaScript than you need, and we don't want to basically give you, a site that we don't want extraneous things. We don't want to increase the page weight more than necessary. These things are important not just because of progressive enhancement, but also because on a large production site that gets a lot of traffic, we need to keep the experience, the page size is relatively lean. So that's kind of the rationale for doing some of this stuff. So what's happening here is a couple tests. One is based on your screen width, one is based on a flag, whether your device supports touch, and another is just based on which class came off that body tag. So these are three different kinds of tests to figure out what to load. So this one's kind of interesting. So if your screen width, and by the way, screen width is not the same as your viewport, that's the width of your entire device. If it's greater than 480, and that number might mean something to some people, that is, it's your iPhone and landscape. Basically, if you're greater than 480 pixels, we're going to load the fonts. So the fonts are kind of an interesting story. We had the fonts redrawn from the bureau that makes them, from the Type Foundry. And those font files are fairly large. Like, you don't want to deliver those probably to a constrained device that's on a 3G network, because the overhead would just be too high. So what we're saying is we're making an assumption here. Basically, we're saying that if your screen width is greater than 480, you're probably a more capable device. You're probably on a better connection, although that's not necessarily true. I'll say that up front. But we're kind of making an assumption here that you can probably handle the extra overhead of the fonts. So if you don't have the fonts, you still get a good experience. You just default back to, I think it's the Georgia or Times typeface. The next kind of test that happens is around touch. So if your device supports touch, then it loads the touch library. That's jQuery Mobile. That's another project that Filament Group is pretty heavily involved in. The last example here is saying if you're on a gallery page, load these JavaScripts relevant to galleries. So that's kind of nice. So if you're on like an article page, it's not going to load those. If you're on a gallery page, it's going to load those. So a fact of our site is that it's a huge news website. There's a lot of caching going on. So in most cases, you're going to get like a cache file. It's not, the server isn't going to actually render the file and deliver it back to you. So, but that's what this is happening here. So it's kind of a smart way to load assets. And then the last thing that this controller file does is basically, using a couple methods, script and style, it takes that array of scripts or CSS and loads them back into the head. So if you're going to enhance the browser, it's going to remove that basic experience, figure out where you are on the site, package up the scripts that you need, and load them back into the head. And this is an example down here of what the final markup for a JavaScript might look like. You notice it's kind of this weird, like, comma-separated list of all the scripts. The reason it's formatted like that is because we concatenate on the server. So that will go back to the server will parse through all those, build one concatenated file, and deliver it back. So we do concatenation, obviously for performance reasons, but as you'll see later, that also has some limitations as well. Right, so what about media queries? Reliance on media queries means they must work everywhere. So the Globe site uses media queries. A lot of you probably play with the Globe site. You can see how the layout changes. It's pretty good stuff. But the browsers less than IE9, IE6, 7, and 8, those browsers get an enhanced experience, but they don't natively support media queries. So we have to find a way around it. There's other browsers that don't support media queries, obviously, but those are the big ones that represent the majority of the traffic that we're going to get through browsers that don't support media queries, if that makes sense. So we use a polyfill. And if anybody's not familiar with the concept of a polyfill, it's just you're just adding functionality to the browser that you expect would be there for somebody to use the site as you want them to. And in this case, Respond.js is what we kind of settled on. Respond.js, again, is a Filament Group project. You can kind of get a picture of why we worked with them. We use Respond.js because it's a very lightweight polyfill for media queries. There's other ones out there that you guys may or may not know about. And the reason we use this one is that we just want kind of bare minimum support. It's a small file, and it's great. I mean, it works really well. There's some drawbacks. I mean, it uses AJAX calls. It basically makes a call out to your CSS, pulls it back in, rips through it, and puts those styles into the head of your file on window resizing. So because it's an AJAX request, if you're hosting your files on a CDN somewhere on a different domain, that can cause a security violation across browsers. So you need kind of some extra strategies to kind of deal with that particular fact. But I believe Respond added a way to deal with that, but it's still kind of troublesome. We ran into a few hitches with that, but for the most part, it works great. And Scott Gell, who works at Filament, he's responsible for this script. He's good. I'll give him a little plug there. Okay, and I'll let Dan talk about Respond.
Yeah. So Jesse gave you a breakdown of what goes into the architecture of BostonGlobe.com. I'm going to talk quickly about another tenet of responsive design, which is delivering an image to a user at a size that is applicable for their device, right? So if you're on an iPhone or an Android, you don't want to receive the same large image size as you would on a desktop. And that's just good stuff, right? Giving them the right tool for the right job. And so that allows us to have mobile optimized images in the markup, and then if we decide that your browser can handle a larger image, or if we decide that your device can handle a larger image, we'll give you that larger image. And we do all of that without any user agent sniffing, because that's bad. Okay, cool. So we use responsive images from Filament Group because they're so awesome. That's the solution that we use. That's the GitHub if you guys want to check out exactly what's going on there. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. So the first thing that happens is that the responsive image inserts a base element into the head, and we redirect all subsequent requests through that. So that allows us to capture. Hi.
Just quick clarification when you say, because you've said it a couple times, no UA sniffing.
Yeah.
So you're gonna rely on what's in the get.
We're going to rely on what?
You're gonna rely on what, everything that the browser told you in the get.
We're relying on the,
And you're not gonna invoke any code that,
we're setting a bunch of tests. And whatever those tests come back as, we're making assumptions that your browser can either handle A or B. B being an enhanced version, A being a less than fun version. So we're not doing a user agent sniff to tell that you're on an iPhone. I'm sending you a bunch of tests using Modernizer, and whatever the result of those tests are, I'm making assumptions that you can either handle A or B. Yeah? So, responsive images. That's the markup. The markup is has a mobile image in the source, right? That's a small image, and we signify that with a .r. The dataful source contains the path to the larger sized image. In our case, we point that directly to the CDN, and that helps get over that the cross-domain security issue that we were talking about earlier. And then on the server, this is the rule that actually redirects that image back to the proper. It's the rule that redirects the image to the correct size for that user. It's XML. It probably means nothing, but that's what it. There it is. So the first thing that happens is that we capture that .r image because that's signifying that's a responsive image, and we return them temporarily with a rwd.gif. rwd.gif is a 1x1 transparent pixel. That's what they get in response. So that does two things. It prevents that resizing. If we were to hand them a small image and then swap it out, you would see the content shift. So we're trying to stay away from that. I think 1x1 satisfies that, right? So then when the markup is done loading, the script sets the responsive image source to either the small or large size if specified, depending on if you're ready to do it. So now we're taking that 1x1 GIF, removing it, and if you are allowed to get that larger image, we're stuffing that into the source. And now you have your image experience, either small if you're on a smaller device, or large if you're on a browser that can handle it. The next thing I'm going to talk quickly about is responsive video, and responsive really should be in quotation marks here, so I apologize. Because it's not really responsive, right? Well, it's not responsive in the same tenets that Ethan Marcotte has laid out, or but by definition. So you guys are probably active on Twitter and you've seen FitVids.js that was out a couple weeks ago, and I think there's a couple other libraries out there that try to take markup from different content providers like YouTube and Vimeo and all these other things and make it more responsive by wrapping a div around it and doing all sorts of fun things. That's essentially what we're doing. However, we don't have the luxury of copy and pasting a single video from a site. All the content producers that are building bostonglobe.com don't have the time to copy and paste a video into the page and publish it statically like that. So this is all dynamic. We use Brightcove. I need to mention this is Brightcove specific implementation. That's our third-party vendor for video. So we want to stick with the ideas of progressive enhancement and responsiveness, right? So in our example, this is the markup that comes generated from the content management system to put a video into the page. There's three things that are going on here, three things that help us build that video and make the request to Brightcove and dump it on the page. First is actually saying that it's a class of video player. Then there's data schema, and data schema is kind of cool. It helps us define a version of the player. So if I needed to have multiple article players, if in 2 months I was told that the article player needs to have a new look and feel, but we still need to maintain the old article player look and feel. The data schema allows us to set one, and that means it's this certain video ID, player ID, excuse me. And then later on in the markup, if I set the data schema to 2, we can grab the second article player look and feel. And I'll show you that in the next slide. It'll make a little more sense. Data player is the actual player type to use. We have it set here to article. So imagine in your object you have 6 or 7 different definitions of what a player should look like. That's telling us what those players are. And we'll see that again. And then data params is the actual video clip ID that we send off to Brightcove. Brightcove needs that in order to return us the proper video. So you can see that there are some things here that could be done better, right? It'd be really cool if all that was in a video object in the HTML5 video source, so that if the device had no JavaScript or whatever, the browser would still render a video. Right now, we're really heavily relying on JavaScript in order to deliver the video to the page. Subpar, right? Right. So one of the great things that we're able to do is, because we are at the Globe, we're able to work really tightly and closely with the video developer, video vendor. So we were able to go over to Brightcove and talk to them about this and say, hey, you know, it'd be really cool if you did this a different way. Can you help us out? They said no. But the thoughts are out there, right? Like, they obviously have things that they're beholden to. They want to have metrics and ads and this, that, and the third. Understandable, right? I want to have the best experience for everyone that comes to the site. So we're kind of on different levels, but you know, just to be able to talk to them and tell them that there's better ways to do this is interesting, and I hope that conversation can continue, because I think video is radically changing, and that's the end of my sentence. All right. So in order to make some of the videos a little more responsive, we do what we would do for an image, right? We would set the max width at 100%. Cool, you guys are good with that. And then this is a little bit of what happens in the JavaScript. This is obfuscated almost to the point of uselessness, but, and I'd be happy to show you, or you can even go check it out. Globe-video.js is the JavaScript on bostonglobe.com, and you can check out exactly what's happening there. There's a couple dependencies I probably should mention. Is Ben Alman's BBQ plugin? Yes, awesome, good stuff. So this is using that to do to build the actual object. All right, so the schemas. The schemas is where we're setting all the values that we need to actually build a player. You see we have some default parameters, the params that actually the Flash object needs in order for Brightcove to decide what it's going to hand you back, right? And then the article is where we're actually setting what the player ID is, and that's, remember where I said, like, if we change it to data schema 2 and we had another article player, we could do some deep recursion and dump that on top, and that's the one that it would use. And then there's some sloppy math to get the general size of what video should be returned back. Brightcove, in the version of Brightcove that we're using, it needs that height and width in order to know what video to return back to it. So we're just doing some quick and dirty math there and returning it back. And then here's where we actually start to build that object. So we're setting an ID on. We're setting an ID, a class name, and for each of those, we're looping through and building that param up. That's where Ben comes in. That's where Ben's plugin comes in handy. That's weird. So yeah, so we're looping through all those parameters and building up the object and appending it to the markup. And initializing Brightcove experiences, that last line. That's what fires off. That's what sends off to Brightcove's API all that information, so we can get the video back into the page. So that is how we do that video. That's how we can get a video onto the page in a way that is progressively enhanced, and again, that's in quotes, right? But it is the best way, instead of actually jamming that object onto the page and saying, hey, here's a flash object, do what you can if you can do it. So those are some of the things that happened on bostonglobe.com. And there's a lot more, right? But we only have a limited amount of time. And I'm sure you'll have questions, so you can ask us some questions too. So Jesse's going to jump back up here and talk a little bit about managing the growth of a site like bostonglobe.com. Boston Globe.
Okay, right, so the BostonGlobe.com was, it was kind of a unique situation, I think, because we had the ability to start from scratch. So a lot of people may look at this and be like, well, you were able to do certain things because you started with a completely blank slate. Like, what about my site? I have, you know, all these gnarly HTML pages and these crazy dependencies going everywhere, and how am I ever going to turn that into a responsive site? But I think the fact that we were able to start with a blank slate kind of taught us some unique lessons, and caused us to kind of think a little bit about like what's going to happen when the site grows, because a large news site like the BostonGlobe.com will grow quickly. News sites accrue content very quickly, and they tend to accrue a lot of you know, other things like a lot of JavaScripts for various projects that, you know, occur over time. And we know that to be true on Boston.com. Its current implementation has been around for a while, and there's a lot of content on that site. So one of the things that Dan and I have been sort of discussing is like, what's going to happen when the site grows, because we need to continue to deliver a lean and mean experience to devices that can't handle a lot of overhead. So I guess that's kind of something, it's an interesting discussion. I guess it's somewhat unique to a larger site that's trying to use these techniques. And I guess that's why I want to talk about it a little bit. So the second point about managing asset bloat and creating monolithic files, that's where that kind of comes into play. I guess what I'm getting at there is we do a good job of testing to figure out the capabilities of your device and delivering an experience, but it's still possible to deliver a little bit too much overhead to certain devices. They can slow down the page loading. The way we use concatenation is that essentially all the scripts, when I went through that routine earlier about how scripts get packaged and delivered, those are all concatenated into one file, and it works pretty well. They aren't minified yet, but I think we're moving to minification soon. That will help alleviate that some. But over time, you know, you can imagine as the content grows and the functionality grows on the site, that file will continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and basically, you know, it can create some headaches. So there's other things like dependencies and kind of like one-off scripts. Like how do you manage this stuff as the site starts to grow? There's always the ever-present, you know, fear of global variable collisions. We do a good job of like namespacing our JavaScripts, and that's like a really important practice that has to continue. So one thing that we're kind of interested and we're thinking about is like how to better manage the assets so that you can deliver a leaner kind of suite of scripts to somebody if their device can't handle it, or at least kind of gain some more control, you know, over, you know, this kind of delivery. So module dependency management, there's various libraries out there that do that. Like one that the name we throw around is Require.js. It does some interesting things along the lines of breaking up your scripts into modules and managing some of the dependencies on that. And I guess, but no matter what we do, we always need to make sure that there's the test suite that we deliver, where I showed you, figures out if your browser's enhanced or not. That test suite needs to always be there. So whatever solution we have, we need to make sure that's living side by side with our ability to, you know, figure out like what your browser is capable of. So these aren't easy problems to solve, and because, you know, large responsive sites are kind of a new thing, it's an interesting discussion, I think, and so I think it's worth, you know, talking about in the community. And I think Dan's going to talk for a minute or two about.
Yeah.
about ads.
My turn again.
Advertising.
So, remember how I said, like, responsive design in a big site is different than a portfolio site, right? This is one of the bad parts of that difference, is having to use ads to generate revenue, which is what keeps us in jobs if you work on a big site. And we all know how bad ads are, right? Who's worked here with any sort of ad network? Great. So document.write is probably, document.write. I don't have to say anything else. So that's the problem with ads, is that they are really bad. They use really bad JavaScript practices, which really hinders us from doing things in a smart, responsible way. Not only do they use document.write, but they're also just dumping stuff onto your page whenever they need to, whenever they feel like it. You don't have really control over that. Another important note to make here is that with a responsive design, there's got to be a shift in culture, if you will, with the people that actually sell those ads, because that ad is no longer going to be in the same place all the time, right? And that's sort of like a, oh my goodness to those guys when their client calls them and says, why is it halfway down the page when I thought I paid for something at the top? So if you work in a larger corporation that is relying on this revenue, that turns into a pretty big issue. So not only do we have to get a shift, not only does it have to be a shift with the ad networks themselves to deliver or to give us a way to control those ads, but there also has to be a shift within our own companies to say, now we're serving now we're serving the same ad to multiple platforms. You got to be wary of this, and maybe we do that with packages, different. I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know why I'm speculating out loud right now. But I think it's important to start those conversations sooner rather than later, or we as developers are going to always be scrambling to satisfy some guy in a fancy shirt with a tie. Sorry. What he wants. So our solution is to shove all those ads into iframes, which works, but not when you're talking about ads, because now you can't do rich media ads, right? You can't do those ads that cost thousands and thousands of dollars that, again, keep us in jobs. You can't break out of that iframe, you can't take over the page, you can't float across something and annoy the hell out of you. So we shove those into iframes, and then as we resize, we hide or show that ad as applicable, right? So I'm going to jump over and show you exactly what's going on, because it's a little bit easier to see here. So you can see this is a nice ad for the Museum of Science. I'm glad, it's educational. That's cool. All right. So as we resize the page down, that ad is doing what it's done, and then, oh my goodness, it disappeared. And it's been hidden, that position has been hidden, and we've shown the other position at a lower breakpoint. So now we can control not only the content and how the content is reflowing, but also where those ads should be as that content reflows. So that's cool. And we do that, it happens all the way down the page. And you know what? When I'm looking at this, that's actually wrong. But I'll fix that later for you. Weird. There actually should be one that shows up in the top here. It should move over into the second column and be above this. And then another one pops. All right, what? You didn't know. Why am I telling you? Okay, so we'll work on that later. But you get the general idea, right? Now we're controlling the content and we're controlling the ads. And that control is what keeps us being responsive. And you can see how an ad and the ad exec will get a little up in arms because now their thing is moving all over the page and oh my goodness, what's happening? Where's my impressions? So that's ads. I think I have another slide about ads. Yeah. So, remember I mentioned how, like, because we're a larger corporation, we were able to start some talks with Brightcove. Well, we were able to sit down with our ad vendor too and say, you guys are doing it really bad. Let's work together and see what we can do to better manage this ad process. They said no. No, so they again are using archaic technology. They are set in their ways, and it's harder for them to move forward and move fast. So we presented the idea of maybe there's JSON-P that we can do, that we can start to control these things. They said, well, why don't you just build something on your server that sanitizes all the stuff you don't want? And then I was like, well, then you're making us build an ad server. Why do we need you? And, so there's that. But, again, my hope is that these conversations will continue and we can start building something that will be out there and sort of change and move along as we as developers start doing cooler and cooler things. And then there's this example of a responsive ad that we did that's on the site now. You want to see it? Sure. Cool. So this ad is going to start doing responsive things. And by responsive, we mean as we shrink down, it's going to move and be all fun. So, good times. This is actually not being served from the ad server at all, because our iframe solution is kind of hindering us from doing any of that. In order for an iframe to work, all browsers, we have to set a hard width on it, so this is not going to work everywhere. We have to pull that out of the ad server. We're actually just serving the tracking pixel in an iframe off to the side. And this is markup that we have to put on the page from the content management system, which is suboptimal, to say the least. But it gives us not only was the advertiser satisfied with how that's working, but it also gave us a reference point of saying, now this is what we're trying to do. Let's work together to do this and do this from your ad network. Yeah. I think that's all we have to say right now. Ian and Kaz are going to get up, and they're going to talk about the MySave implementation.
Questions. There's plenty of time.
Sure. You want some questions?
Q&A now?
Yeah. Yeah. Shall we?
Well, I wanted to ask a question about, you put a lot of work into making responsive design, and you said are you tracking now your, who you're serving, and can you make a case now that you've been out for a couple months that it's been worth it, that you've had an increase in mobile visits, or you've had, that people click more on the ads,
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. It looks cool, right? I think
It
that's
looks
worth it.
cool.
Yeah.
When you ask the question, was it worth all this effort? I'm sure someone's asked you that.
Yeah. I mean.
What's your answer?
Dan is a very positive person, so.
I am. The numbers I try to stay away from. I don't know what the conversions are from A to B versus one section to another. I'm sure Adam probably has numbers for you, right? But was it worth it? Yeah. We got to do some really cool stuff. We got to work with some really cool people.
We won an Epi today, multiple Epis today.
I don't even know what that means.
We don't either.
So I think from a developer standpoint, I think it was worth it because this is the way that we should be going, right? We should be moving the internet forward and not staying in the same place where we were 5 or 6 years ago. I hope that's an acceptable answer. Yes?
So, and I wasn't at the last presentation, so this may have been already covered, just to shut up, but
No.
there might have been some design, some objectives that led to some design principles that led you to make certain assumptions about what you could or couldn't do on the server, and what you could or couldn't do on the JavaScript side, what the technical performance for some very vague definition of performance of your work had to be. What what were the big drivers for that, and how do you know if you got them? I mean, it looks a lot better, and it's snappier, and it's responsive. It does all that stuff. But.
So a lot of the design from last month, Upstatement presented some of the initial designs that they had done. A lot of the design was not developer driven. Mm-hmm. So to be honest, it was basically, we've heard you can do all these amazing things with the internet, now make them happen. So there was a number of, parts where it was just kind of insert magic server in the initial design, which I think wound up being a very good thing because we were able to build a site that, came out of the mind of editorial department of a newspaper.
Right, I know there was a goal to make this really a reader's experience. And if you haven't noticed, you have to pay to use the site. The section fronts on the homepage are free, but if you want to read anything, at some point you hit the paywall. And it was kind of billed as like we want to build like a really good reader experience. So that's where some of the conversation started, was around that. Yeah, that's all I have to add.
You showed us how your server ends up concatenating a bunch of JavaScript files together, given whatever the characteristics of the browser are. Aren't you finding that that group of JavaScript files end up falling together in like maybe six distinct permutations or something, like some really finite number of permutations? And
Our cache is?
You can just pre-compile all those and throw it up on a CDN and like cover all 6 permutations?
They are all up on a CDN. It's just that if for some strange reason a page shows up with a permutation that isn't right now cached, that will hit the cache server. So once an hour the server recompiles that, I believe, but otherwise it's being served cached.
Okay, because what I recall was said was that it was even not unified. Is that?
Yeah, not yet.
Not yet, not at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're getting there.
That's an interesting content management system, character encoding, fun thing.
I guess what I kind of hear you saying is it better to use kind of a traditional make process to build these scripts and throw them on CDN versus dynamically creating them, in the browser? I guess there's things can change frequently enough, and if we want to change the test suite, a little bit and tweak it here and there, then it turns out to be, better to build these dynamically in a browser and load it that way. Yeah.
Just build a concatenated thing for the browser. I noticed that when you started, it's like, oh, you could do some of this, server-side and pre-calculate what the combinations were going to be, but why not? In some cases, since you can. But I actually wanted to ask, have you experimented at all with, I don't know much about this, but string loading is have you heard this phrase?
Not familiar.
For JavaScript. I've seen it recently used, I think some experiments were done, and I'm not really an expert in this area, so I don't want to. There's some pretty strong overhead when a script tag is loaded, a script element is actually loaded because browsers try to parse the JavaScript. And so there are some solutions which actually load that all either as a string or do a trick and then eval it. And some experiments were done recently or actually in the last couple of years ago, where you can get some significant speed ups, especially in mobile, if you load it all as a string and then eval as needed. And there are some libraries out that are trying to do things like this.
The caveat that eval is a tricky thing.
I know. Well, eval, I mean, obviously, this is one of those restricted cases where, you can create a sandbox which evals things nicely for you, and you don't say, you don't have to fall back on the eval as evil slogan.
Is that a recent thing, though, or is that from a couple of years? Because I feel like with what they're doing with JIT in the browser now, you're better off.
Yeah, like, is it better? Yeah. So what I saw was a couple analysis posts from late 2009, and they were on, what's his name? The guy that did, I'll remember it, of course, after I talk. But, so they're getting built into a couple libraries right now. Browser Package Manager, which is being used by the Destructor 2, is doing a lot of this. And yeah, at the time, certainly, you know, the benchmarks said, oh, this actually works really well, right? The eval is the same, you know, the eval time is the same, right? But you only eval what you need, so you get to initial page load faster on a browser, you know, like on a mobile browser, that kind of thing. So that was a couple years ago. Whether, you know, the eval thing may be constant, you know, or the parsing may be constant, may not be affected by the JIT. In fact, I doubt it would, unless there's something else in browser. I mean, you know, browser technology is constantly changing, so.
Well, but JIT's also analyze loops. Will then cache those loops. Not cache, but compile down when it can, optimize when it can. Then definitely, like in Java Land, for example, like programs will get faster once they run for a minute.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So
once they're running.
And also
but not the initial.
on site like that does definitely sound like something that would be interesting to look into. But the other thing too is when you have so many moving pieces, adding
Right,
another
adding
moving
one more
piece is always fun. Yeah.
In a sense, I didn't mean to start explaining it so much as I was just curious whether you heard of it or were looking at it.
I've heard of. I used to do interesting things with eval. When I made a gaming engine once. Testing performance.
Yeah.
Can we measure its performance for any kind of bottlenecks on different devices, see where you can make improvements?
Yeah, you know, I think you saw how we're concatenating those all into one giant string, right? We're not really taking advantage of the browser being able to download multiple things at the same time in and of itself. So, you know, whereas that's not maybe a bottleneck, that's probably not, maybe concatenating everything into one file isn't the best answer. Maybe there's another way to do it. Measurements for exact bottlenecks, ads, tracking pixels, those kinds of things.
Blocking scripts.
Yeah.
So.
So, quick question was, when you're doing the videos and the images in particular, how much of the information you need to properly position and resize those comes from the actual content author through the CMS, and how much are you calculating on your layer? Like, is it just a matter of content author says, I want videos somewhere around here, and then you figure everything else out, or do they have to upload specific different sizes?
Oh, no, if they say they want the video on the page, and the video goes on the appropriate slot on that page. They just say, we need this video on this page. We need this image on this page. Or the CMS will build pages on its own, and again, put the image where it needs to be. And then that markup is in the page, and and then it's handed off to the JavaScript to handle adding, removing, manipulating.
Yeah, cool.
But we make a decision, you know, kind of a business decision. We're going to say, we're going to serve a small image and a large image. So in the CMS, somewhere in the stack, there's logic that says when an author has an image, create two images, small and big one.
Right.
Yeah.
So you were talking about, I mean, ads can really hose page loads, and they're ugly and all that. And you were talking about, you know, just running your own service. I mean, that obviously has cost. But is that something you guys have thought about in terms of getting better page loads and better performance? And, you know, say, yes, it's going to be a cost to run the service and have people run the service, but on the other hand, like, not get hosed by crappy ads.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a conversation that we've fully explored yet, right? Because there's a lot of overhead to get that going and to get it moving when ads are still constantly being sold and advertiser and sales rep wants it now, right? So it is a conversation that we've had, but it hasn't been fully explored. I guess I would rather that we be able to work with the actual ad networks so that so we're not the only ones that are benefiting from sanitizing their ads, but they're actually delivering them to multiple people. But we had the conversation with our ad network last week, where we sort of started hashing out how to better do this. So we're still really at the beginning, working with them to hand off those ads to us in a different way, so we can have more granular control.
And also, it's a conversation that's starting to happen in the community. There's a couple designers out there. One named Roger Black. There's another guy named Mark Bolton. There's a third guy named Nathan Ford. They're starting to talk about these things in their blogs. I can't point to any specific links, but they're talking about it on Twitter and talking about more on the creative level, not so much on how do you stop blocking JS. But it's an interesting conversation.
Well, Mark Bolton brought up the point recently that it's really limiting what you can do with responsive design because of the fact that, no, this is how ads are sold.
Right.
You know, an advertiser could potentially have a better response with something that works better for the device, but the way ads are sold, it can block it.
But there's an interesting counterpoint to that. When you build a site with one code base for all devices, what you're telling the salesperson is that you, before you might have had, this isn't the case in the Globe, this is just a hypothetical. Before you might have had an iPad app, you might have had an iPhone app, you might have had all the different products you could sell ads to, but now you have one because there's one code base. So if you were trying to sell ads, you lived off the commission, how would that make you feel? So there's an interesting conversation there about the sales model itself, you know.
Let's grab a couple more and then we'll jump over to Ian and Kaz. Right in the middle there.
You said that two of your major problems that seem to be out of your control and short are videos and ads. If you had 6 more months and an unlimited budget, what problem would you tackle?
6 more months and an unlimited budget. That's a good question. Next question. Unlimited budget.
There's too much liquor in the world. I think video.
I mean, I would really like to see a video solution that actually is progressively enhanced. To actually put the video source into the page, and then we key off of that if you need flash, and all the metrics and advertising things happen within that video tag. I think would be a huge win. But that's a really good question. Oh yeah. A better way to handle actually appending third-party scripts and the resulting markup to a page, non-blocking, right. all the different things that come with that would be another fun thing to tackle.
I think you forgot something. I think Scott Gell, I think it was maybe Scott Gell had or somebody from Filming Group had a slide show based on this, or a talk they given, and the best slide ever was like document right, no script.
Yeah, right.
And sorry, that just had to be.
The ridiculousness is everything. Yeah.
Gentleman in the blue shirt is going to be our last one.
First of all, my name is Adam Burknett. I work at engineers can talk to me afterwards. But
Well
any
done.
major surprises while you were doing this? Any big potholes, any big gotchas?
The whole thing. Well, one of the big gotchas was as we were working with this market, we're also working with a brand new content management system that no one had seen before. So that was a major hurdle to get over. I don't do Java. I was doing Java. So those kinds of things were major gotchas. It really, I don't want to say it slowed us down, but it did slow us down. It slowed us way down.
But it prints the newspaper as well as the website.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good point, Kevin. Well, we can talk about that after. I feel like we should get going with Ian and Kaz's presentation.
I'm Ian. I'm Kaz. We're basically back-end developers, so this is kind of out of our element a little bit here. But we did end up working on a lot of JavaScript to tightly couple MySaved with the back end.
Yes.
So who knows what my saved is? Okay. Yeah, that's impressive. Kaz,
All right,
what's that?
so why? Why am I sick? So I'll go over the whys and then we'll show it to you. Why? Well, people like reading newspapers because it gives you a certain experience. You know, you start out at a section, the section you like, you read a story, maybe you come back to the front of the section to find another story, or maybe there's another story on the page that you've continued to that catches your eye, or you can flip through, but it gives you a very kind of natural feeling that's missing from a lot of websites and especially from most news websites. Kind of like a TV, users want to be able to like flip from thing to thing very quickly. We did a bunch of initial testing before designing the site. By we, I mean none of us. And one thing that they found was about 1 in 10 people, Damien, were you involved in the testing? No, okay. Well, about 1 in 10 people they found was maybe an advanced web user and discovered that, you know, tab browsing is amazing. Like, you can go to a website and open up 10 tabs for the 10 stories you want to read, and then read through them and not have to worry about wondering where you were. But eventually, if you're like me, you get that. This is, I think, maybe 1/4 of the tabs I have right now. So, instead, some of the high muckamucks at the Globe came up with this idea that users should be able to save a story on any device, anywhere, and then be able to read that story on any other device, even if you were in a train tunnel without wireless service. It's kind of fun when we have to explain to them that maybe the device had to at one point be connected but to get the information offline. But so there's an interesting thing because you have to be able to save an article in, well, I don't know, links even, Netscape or whatever, IE. But then, you know, be able to read it offline on a device that's capable of those kind of advanced things. So HTML5 is great, but really easy to get cut by the bleeding edge, which we'll get into towards the end. And my grandma is still using IE7 or less, and she is a very big part of our demographic. So it's really easy to make WebKit web apps work, you know, or maybe even make it work in Firefox, no problem. Nice and easy. Making something that works everywhere, a little bit more fun. So we're gonna get down to business, and Ian's gonna give you a day in the life of a page load on the front page.
Yeah, okay, so this is our Boston Globe cloud. Okay, so if you look at the home page, you'll see a bunch of indicators of My Saved. We have the count of how much you've saved. We have a drawer at the bottom where you can scroll through all the articles you have saved. You can pop up that drawer and see some previews of each article, some summary text, publication date, categories, and we want all that information to be savable from any device and then accessible from any device. Because these devices may be on 3G, we want to pull down as much content as possible in asynchronous, non-blocking way and store it through whatever you have available, app cache, local storage. Okay, so when we have a big look at the home page, I take a screenshot of a Chrome browser to confuse myself. So if you look at this home page, this is not even a home page, it's a sports page. If we go to a home page, you'll see there are a lot of articles represented on this home page.
About 90.
Yeah. And let's log in so that we can actually
Pay no attention to this.
Password is not password. Okay. So, it's not a password? It's not a password. Okay.
Capital N is not.
So each one of these is an article and has a save button which pops up when you hover. In order to do that, we need to check whether each of these is saved. So we had a bunch of ideas about how we could do that. One idea is to try to grab, well, first of all, we need a way to identify each of these. So if you actually look in the source, you'll see that each one of these on the anchor has a data UUID attribute, which is an identifier from the content management system of this article. We can tie that to your user ID and store that relationship to check if you have something saved. So you can imagine if there are 90 of these things, to make a single request where we throw 90 of these UUIDs in like a query string probably is not going to work. I mean, right? Each one of those is, yeah, you can post it, but you end up having to gather you have a huge request going out and a huge response. And then that means that the first result of checking whether this article is saved won't show up until the very last one has been checked. And actually, this doesn't look, oh yeah, so each of these is also checked. So like Kaz said, around 90, 100.
86.
Yeah. So we decided it would be better to check these one at a time and to do it asynchronously, so that you start at the top of the page and you'll immediately quickly get back the response from the first article. And the nice thing is that these buttons are hidden until you hover over them anyway, so it's not a big problem that this is happening over time with many different requests. And Kaz will also explain to you why it's not a problem on the back end to have hundreds of tiny requests going out on each page load, which you can imagine. I mean, if you have 1 million visitors and each one is loading a page, every couple seconds, then we have 100 million requests every couple seconds going out, and we can't cache any of those because those are checking whether or not you have an article saved, which could change any minute if someone chooses to save an article. So that has to be fresh content, and it needs Erlang to work. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. Okay.
Just wondering, is the reason why you didn't do it server side?
Which, the check?
Yeah, just.
Oh, no, that is all server.
No. Well,
Some.
the reason why we didn't do it server side is because that would significantly slow down the page load, right? All of those would have to be checked before the page would render. So this is a way of, we see all the contents on the page, and we're only updating hidden divs with the saved, not saved information. So we get much faster page load.
We also wouldn't be able to cache the content of the article.
Right. Yeah, the whole page. Right. We'd have to fragment the cache. And also, there are different stakeholders who don't want their content to be slower because my saved is, being used. So this is a way of making it so that the experience, someone doesn't have to sacrifice on the page load time experience for my saved. Another benefit is that if you don't have JavaScript, this is very gracefully goes away.
But you can still click the little save static button on every article page.
Right. So if you look at this, you'll see, if you look in the network traffic, a ton of requests going out, each one with a single identifier of the article. And all we're getting back is, you can see also that these are incredibly small requests, which are happening in milliseconds.
So, I'm not sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure I understand the constraint here. So you can't serve with the page, just part of the page, and you were talking about, that just says, here are all the ideas you could be looking at, right? Is that too much? And then...
It's caching layers and how the CMS caches various things.
Okay, so it's just too much work to get that from the CMS.
Yes,
It
and
potentially
also-
busts the cache or something too, or some this kind of constraint?
You're saying that on the server side, look through each article on the page as you're building it and check whether that a user has that article saved?
You can do it locally in the browser, I think.
Right. I'm saying why do they need to, yeah, I guess why don't they just have, I mean, what is preventing you from batching these requests? Just saying, you said something is slow, but I'm not sure I understand the constraint.
Sure.
What is slow?
We would rather have the top of the page, those responses come back immediately, quick, small responses, so that that information is updated, and slowly get down to the bottom of the page, fill in those saved, not saved.
Okay, because the save server can't just respond with 90 articles.
It could respond with 90 articles as well, but then you're also talking, if you have, say, 90 articles saved, do you want on every page load an additional request if you're on a 3G device that maybe you have limited bandwidth of give me all of my articles?
Anything the article text or the saved or not?
Even the save status, although it would still, I mean, you're getting 90 on a home page anyways. There are a number of different reasons. Some of them are more sensible, some of them are more operational reasons as well. That, you know, certain things, for example, we had initially, one requirement we had was that initially the button that's static on every page, that whether you have JavaScript or not, was on every individual article view, not the little on hover buttons, was supposed to show whether or not you had saved that article, which would mean a server-side call. For every article view, our operations team said you're not allowed to add a server-side call on every page render, and so that got killed.
Right. It also becomes a point of failure that if the MySave server goes down and that's required for the page load, then now the page breaks.
Then we get called at 3 in the morning.
No, this is very helpful for understanding what you're up to. The why is it?
So on the bottom, you know the MySave count or the articles. Wouldn't you just know I have 15 articles saved, and you could compare any one of those 90 or 86 against the 15?
Yes. Although we are not pulling down every article that you have saved for that drawer. We're just pulling down 50 or 100, the most recent ones. So a user could potentially save 1,000 articles, and so we don't want to go through each of those and compare them with everything on the home page. Chances are that the home page content is constantly changing, and you don't have a lot of overlap there. It's simpler to do a check for each one.
And all the counts you see of total saved articles and read versus unread articles, those are all calculated server-side.
This also means, that adds a lot of complication if you're, it means that you first have to sync all of the articles that a user has saved locally, and then do all the checks on the save buttons. You also have to keep that information updated before you do all the save buttons. So this seemed like a simpler option to us, where we're checking one canonical source of whether or not an article is saved, and we're doing it with very small requests so that each one is very fast.
As I say, do you check even if they don't have anything saved? And then also, if you're worried about checking so many times, why don't you just check when they hover? The request is so fast. If they hover to check.
It's fast on this network, not so fast on, say, 3G or on. I mean, that is a
we want that to be really snappy. So, and if we did fire off a request on hover, it probably would take a second to come back, and there might be some flicker or something happening there, or it certainly wouldn't be as fast as it is right now, having the information already on the page. One thing that Dan mentioned, which I forgot what the talk that inspired you to do that was that below the fold, we might not have to check those until we scroll down, so maybe we could trigger on some scroll events. These are some optimizations we've been thinking about, so that, you know, if you're only have 20 articles on the screen, we could just check those, and then on scroll, start checking the ones below the fold.
What do you do if there's no home?
That would be, there are two things. You can either two-finger touch on mobile devices that support multi-touch, which will pop up all the save buttons. And we also discovered that if you tap and hold down on mobile device, that does flip on hover. So you can put your finger on the corner of an article title and it'll pop up the save button and save it automatically on iPad, kind of bonus feature that nobody knew about. So I think Damon might have figured it out, actually.
Yeah.
And for reasons of accessibility, we also have some server-side save buttons on, as Kaz mentioned, on the article page.
Statically.
Yeah, you can check it. Although that doesn't update on whether it's saved or not saved. It's just there, and we'll give you feedback with JavaScript if you have it. So it's functional, but not the best experience, but doesn't slow down the page load.
And also, one thing, a lot of those different techniques you were all mentioning, we did a bunch of initial testing, and a lot of our original assumptions kind of got thrown out the window in the process. So we basically kind of went down all of those roads at one point or another, and don't fully remember all of the reasons why we wound up where we wound up, but
That was pretty interesting.
we also, this is more of a back-end thing, but we did do some initial prototyping in Node and Erlang before settling on using Erlang for this, but one thing we did find, we're both back-end engineers technically, but even if you're a front-end developer, you really, if you're working on a project where, I mean, everybody now does a bit back and forth. I mean, Dan's a front-end guy, but was writing Java, you know. Ian did most of the front-end JavaScript on this. Even if you do have defined roles wherever you are, keeping the channels of communication open, especially around like what data is being sent back and forth between the two, I mean, this project, we kind of just had this prototype that had some kind of unrealistic assumptions about how the server side was going to work, but we were able to make it work. But had it perhaps been built from the beginning with input from both sides, it could, you know, you can avoid a lot of problems by staying on the same page in the front and back end.
Cool. Let's move on.
Yes.
Okay, so on the homepage again, we have about 85, depending on how many articles, asynchronous MySaved requests. They look like this. So the total latency for all of these requests is usually under 200 milliseconds. So it's still pretty fast, and this is happening on content which is not visible. So you're not seeing flicker, and it's you know, it's happening after the page loads. So all the other content is already there. It's not being blocked. Okay, so these requests to check whether or not something is saved, each one is about 200 bytes, takes about 25 milliseconds. What? Oh, yeah.
I have a question. Is it that quick because you're using Erlang? Would it
I
be
mean,
as quick as speed off another resolution of Erlang?
Well, probably, I mean, you can get anything just as fast. I mean,
Okay.
if you really, you know, you could have, I don't know, you could have Linux running in JavaScript as long as you have enough servers.
I mean, part of the reasons why this is so fast, and Kaz can talk about this more, is that, Erlang, and the database that we're using is in memory. Kaz can also talk about that more. So reads are really fast for this, and we're doing dirty reads, so we don't have to hit the disk. So that definitely does speed it up, and using, I mean, there are other web frameworks that are really fast that we could use for this, as long as it's not something that has a lot of overhead per request, and something that can handle, like for instance, something like Django would not work well for this, because if you give Django 1,000 requests, it's going to choke. There's too much overhead for each request, and you can't use caching to fix that with something like this, because we need fresh data. Yeah.
So we could have solved it with Django, but with probably 10 times the hardware, or well, more than that, I guess, since nobody remembered to give us a hardware.
Yeah, interesting fact about this. So we were budgeting for, what was it, 100,000 users or something? That was the expected traffic, and then suddenly at the last minute, we were told, oh yeah, by the way, there's going to be a month free trial where all of Boston.com traffic is going to come over to BostonGlobe.com. That was like within a month of this being launched. So we had kind of, because we like to and it's fun, and especially Kaz loves to do this, over-engineer and make things super robust. It was okay. And if you look at the CPU utilization now on these servers, it's like below 10% all the time anyway. So
we could be running it on, we have 3 boxes right now. We could be running it on 1/3 of one of them. But on the other side, that also means that we can scale 20 times, well, 15 times what we have right now, traffic with the hardware we have.
And we definitely do want to add more features to this and make it more more complex. And so having a really efficient base for that means that we can expand and do more interactive things with this content.
So, requests.
Yeah, so each of these requests doesn't have anything in the response body. All we're doing is checking the response code 200-204. We actually didn't use, we originally used 404 for, you know, your article is not found as saved. But then in the IEs, we saw all these awful error messages that were coming up, like 100 errors on the, you know, people were complaining to us, what have you done? You know, we've never seen so many errors on the site. And so, yeah, so we switched to 204, which kind of makes sense, no content. And interesting tidbit is you see that the 204 requests are actually 8 bytes larger, because There are 8 characters here, space and then content, I think, in the response code message. We didn't think about that, so we lost 8 bytes per.
For all you front-end people, this is what back-end people stay up all night thinking about.
How many dollars of bandwidth have we spent on that and people's 3G plans? But we managed to sleep at night. Yeah, so 200, 204. Okay. Do you want to talk about this, or?
Yeah, actually, Dan, this is
That's what I'll have to say.
So this kind of is showing a little bit of how the conditional loading of things that Jesse was describing earlier work. So here we're saying, once again, the all-important 480. The drawer at the bottom of the page that pops up that shows you your saved articles, we don't want to serve that to small screens and mobile devices. Anything that has touch, IE6?
Yep.
What do we do?
We're not. This is just the drawer at the bottom of the page and all the corresponding JavaScript that goes with that. If you're on a device, like a mobile device, that's not going to be a useful experience. You'd go directly to the full My Saved App page, which we'll render, which we'll show you in a bit. So, let's get rid of that extra weight on the page, and the screen real estate, which is much more valuable on a mobile device. You can also see here that we're checking whether you're logged in before running any of the saved JavaScript or even loading any of the JavaScript. So if you're not logged in, not only do we not run the JavaScript, but we don't even serve you any of the saved JavaScript because if you're not logged in, you can't save it.
These are 4 big parts of the application. There's the save/article URL. This is checking saved articles. This is the drawer we were just talking about that gets Ajaxed in. Then here we have content and preview, which we're going to get into. Preview was that little blurb you saw in the drawer, like the title plus the section, what date it was published, and maybe the intro sentence. And content is actually the content.
And this is a nice feature of the Globe controller. We define a lot of global variables here, and we place them in a Globe object, so they're all neatly packaged, and then we can access these everywhere. So rather than in each JavaScript giving the URL that we hit to Ajax in saved content, we define it in one place, and we can edit it in one place.
Yes, very good. Single point of truth. Say it with me, everybody. Single point of truth. All right, so here's some more. Where is this?
So all the local storage stuff, actually, in order to make saved local storage work, jQuery, what is it? It can dump JSON to a string, but it can't take a string and create a JSON object, or is it the other way around? One of them it doesn't do, and JSON 2 does it. So again, big libraries that were only conditionally loaded. If you support local storage, which is a flag, like what Jesse was talking about earlier, the basic base save JavaScript is loaded. If you're on the actual app page, there's more loading. So even within, you're logged in, you're going to be using MySave. Even within that, we're also there's many different levels of requirements for different MySave experiences, and you can see, for instance, jQuery UI stuff is being loaded only under certain conditions when you have the drawer and you want to have some fade effects, but you're not on the app page, because if you're on the app page, there will be a different package in JS.
And the more of this kind of flow control you can do at the beginning, like with the controller, the less error handling and conditions you have to deal with in your actual scripts. So we can write the local storage script assuming you're going to have local storage, not have to worry about you don't have local storage because it's not going to get loaded ever if you don't. And that means there's less places, as Ian was saying, to go change a canonical string or something. So, yeah.
So a lot of the tests that we used here, we put the results of those tests into the Globe variable, so we have that as a global indicator of whether or not you have local storage or something like that. And that way we only have to run these tests once. And like Kaz said, it simplifies code, so we're not rerunning tests and redoing all these conditionals everywhere.
When you're prototyping, always try and build it in a manner that is modular, that you can build on top of. Like, it's very easy to get making something look just right, but it only works for the demo. Like, sometimes you have to do both to get it to, you know, look good enough to whoever you're presenting, but the more you can, so here we have the local storage.
Yeah. So when we started with local storage, we were a bit surprised by, we hadn't really used it before, and we were a bit surprised, well, in big applications, by the limitation. Like, we have a ton of stuff in local storage. We might not want to, we don't have a way of looking up, like, give me all keys that are prefixed with content in an efficient way, or something like that. It's not a database, right? It's a key value store where you say, get me this key, and you get the value, or remove this key. So we kind of rolled our own way of tracking all this by having, keeping track of all the items that are in local storage. We also wanted to kind of stay in our own little sandbox so that if there was other stuff in local storage from some other part of the site, we don't accidentally delete that or, you know, do something bad with that. So we have some properties for MySaved, which we call meta because we're not stomping on anyone else, because there's no one else right now. And so that's you know, we can just keep a version number there, and if, you know, we change the version, we can have some conditional logic or clear everything, kind of like a. It's actually one of the tricky things with working on client-side stuff like this is that when you want to make a change, sometimes the things that you want to change are cached or locally stored on a ton of people's browsers already. So how do you change that if that's already cached? That's a problem that we have with JavaScript too, because you've seen this solution before, that sometimes people will append a query string to kind of cache bust based on the version of the JavaScript or something like that. Or, you know, set a very low expire time. It's this trade-off of we want to have high-performing cached stuff, but we want to update and be invalidated you know, immediately when there's a change or, you know, break fix or something like that. So having some metadata in here lets us do that in a way that's very specific to our needs and not depend on browsers and their, you know, expires, headers, and stuff like that, which will vary across device and, you know, might not be reliable. Someone was talking about counts before. You can see that the JavaScript that's, sorry, the JSON that's pulled down is just stuffed directly into a counts object, and then each article has two pieces of information in local storage. One is the full content of the article rendered by a template, which is specifically for the MySave page, which is pared down, doesn't have videos and galleries and advertisements. It's meant for a, you know, streamlined experience across all devices where you just can focus on the content. And to me, it kind of feels like RSS readers in a way. Like sometimes you'll read something there just because you get more content and less other crap on the site. That's kind of what this is doing. So you got the content, and then you also have the preview block. And both of these templates are just, you saw the endpoints listed you know, here, content and preview. Each time we're trying to get one of these and stuff it in local storage, we're hitting the same endpoint, which means that, like for instance, one of the ways that we were thinking about grabbing this content is to get a big list of all the articles that you have, and then bring down like an Atom feed or something of all that content and save it using the application cache or parse it using local storage. And what we realized is then you end up with a custom file for each user, and that's very hard to cache. But if you're making requests out for each article, everyone is going to be requesting that same endpoint, the same content with a specific ID in the query string. So that can be cached very easily, and it's very fast to render. And we have this preview in the content already rendered with server-side templates, and we debated about whether or not to put like JSON in here or put the full HTML. HTML, of course, being larger size, so that's a trade-off. You can store less, but faster performance. You don't have to build it with JavaScript, but bigger bandwidth because, you know, you have to pull down all this markup. We kind of went with the way that was simplest to maintain and develop, which is have the template stored in one place on the server and be able to edit it there and then have it, you know, that update work everywhere. So rather than having a server-side template, because some of these pages need to work with no JavaScript, so they have to be rendered server-side, and then having a separate process that builds it using like some kind of backbone-ish thing with a model and template on the front end. Nice to have one place where you can make that change.
Syncing.
Sure.
Which one is this? Oh, no, this is the actual, okay, so this is just calling the sync function, right?
Yeah, so this is save article. Right, so this is getting the list of UUIDs that you have saved. And I said we don't want to grab all the content in one stream, but we do grab all the UUIDs that you have, well, the top 50 or something, all the IDs of the articles in one go. And we update local storage with that information. And you'll see, and again, this is something that we can't have cached, so that's where the random cache bus is. And yeah, we know there's also a random thing built into jQuery, but we forgot to use that.
And that's one point I wanted to make also with some of the stuff that Ian was saying, is that little things like forgetting to use the random function in jQuery are the things that you should forget to do. Identify the problems that will be either impossible or impractical to fix once it's in production and attack those, and then worry about those little. There's a lot of stuff we'd love to refactor. There's a lot of, things that could be a little bit better, but there's also a lot of things that we caught that.
Yeah, like we were using no cache headers on these requests and thought that that would be fine, and it was fine in Chrome and Firefox until we got to IE when people were telling us, look, articles don't save on IE, what's up with that? And the reason why they didn't save is because you requested your list of articles you have saved once, and then that was cached forever. So that really sucked, and we caught that before it went live, but I'm sure there are a bunch of other little things like that we should be looking for. Yeah, testing across all the mobile devices, you can't just test like Android and iPhone. It's per device that you really have to check.
It's per device, per network. So we have a content management system that has its own lovely caching layer. Then we have wireless providers that have their own lovely caching layer that they don't really like talking that much about. Then we have the application cache, which we're forcing your browser to explicitly cache certain things. And then we have your browser, which is caching things all on its own. And each of these behaves differently, and it can be lots of fun.
And behaves differently cross-device. So when certain AJAX may be cached by a Chrome browser, might not be cached by IE. Or vice versa. So that was really tricky for testing and figuring out what the problem is.
And if you're using either local storage or app cache or any of the new HTML5 specs, get really, really, really comfortable reading the actual specifications. And then also look at the previous versions. Because, for example, we had something break a few weeks ago on our app cache page. Which, should we get to that? Is it right next? Or? No, it's more thing. Okay, I'll talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, so here we have some basic syncing. This is just kind of back-endy stuff, so even though it is JavaScript. Yeah, more syncing. So basically, one thing to note about, someone have a question? One thing to note about local storage is, so we want to clean up after ourselves because most devices do have around a 5 megabyte limit, and you can maybe increase that, but we want to keep this down. So when, if you need to explicitly kind of do garbage collection, you have to delete these items from local storage if someone unsaves them, and that's what we accomplish by keeping kind of an index, a list of all the items that you have saved, and if when you sync again, you don't have that item in your list, we'll delete it from local storage. And this is happening on every page, not just on the My Save page. So the first time you visit the site on a new device, all of your saved articles, all the content and previews are being pulled down into local storage, and that's happening after the page load. It's like one of the last things that happens. So that way, when you actually go offline, you're on the train or something, as long as you've gone to some page on the site, you'll have all your content there. And we'll talk about how that offline stuff works shortly. So kind of we try to abstract all the getting and setting stuff in local storage, and you can see here, like, you know, this getting stuff. So we have one method for setting the content or the preview, and if we don't provide anything to that method, we're going to go and grab that content directly from the server. So this is a nice way of showing you know, one place to set content and kind of fail-safes for if you don't have local storage. Well, if you don't have local storage, actually, you would never even run this code.
This is if you have it saved already, it's not going to go do it again. It's just going to say, oh, here it is. If you don't, it will go off.
Yeah, so this is an example of how we actually update articles on the page. The nice thing about this is that it's the same code that's run whether or not you have local storage. This is whether you're online or offline, you can run the same JavaScript. And it still works because it first tries to fetch the data from your local storage, and if that doesn't work, then fetches it. And if you're also online, it'll fetch it from the server. So it fails nicely if you're offline, it fails nicely if you don't have local storage, and you don't need a whole separate method for those different scenarios.
App cache.
You'd love to talk about this.
Yes, app cache is really cool. Like he was mentioning, initially we were kind of thinking that we might use it to kind of store an Atom-like feed of all of your articles and everything, but the more we played around with it, the more little edge cases we found with it and everything. App cache is currently a great way to specify static resources, and it's kind of a little wonky for everything else. There's a few little tweaks that could make it a lot better, but we found at least in this instance, it was better to use local storage, kind of roll our own little mini DB on top of local storage to store all the content, and then for things that weren't going to change much, use the application cache.
Out of curiosity, who uses application cache on their work website?
You're an edge case, Pascal. Yeah. So
as Kaz was saying, this is actually it's a very fragile thing.
Do you want to explain application cache a little?
Sure.
Let's
application cache is really just a list of files, and those are files that you want the browser to save and cache forever, or until you don't want them cached anymore, so that you can access and use a website offline.
So this is the actual MySafe page, and if you look at the source, you'll see that there's a manifest file which is requested in manifest attribute on the HTML tag. So if we go to this, you'll see this is just a plain text file with certain special content type of.
Has to say cache manifest. This is the standard practice for invalidating your cache manifest is up a number 1. As long as 1 byte on the manifest changes, the browser will re-download everything else.
So we're actually using a timestamp to invalidate the cache, and so that's updating every minute. We could get smarter about that.
For a while, we were sending some of the users' counts to the app cache, so it was being dynamically generated on a per user basis, but that can get a little once all that logic comes.
So the app cache is saving a local copy of all the markup of the current page, which is the MySafe page in this case, and copies of all of these assets that are listed here, and so that all of these can be loaded while you're offline. The problem with that is that, for instance, on the MySafe page, it's a list of all the articles that you have and whether or not they're read or unread, and that. Looking at
You're looking at UUIDs, I'm sure.
Yeah, so if someone reads an article like this and then refreshes the page, we don't want that to be cached. We want that to be updated. And so by passing just the user's counts out of local storage or something, or it wasn't out of local storage, it was
from
a complicated way, getting it from the server, that would invalidate this cache. another problem is that unless you explicitly mention something, if one of these assets changes, goes away, and the request fails,
Or just 404s once, randomly.
Everything else in the app cache will fail unless we give explicit direction on how to proceed in case of failure. So that was a little tricky. It was also a very manual process to figure out what assets are actually on this page, and problems with that are that some of the assets are defined in global CSS or in global nabs, and those may change. And so this is actually a very interesting question. Dan and Jesse were talking about how you have many different combinations of concatenated CSS and JS which are loaded on a page. Well, how do you decide which version to put in this static app cache file so that it works for all users? Because each different experience, different featured browser is going to define a different string.
Thankfully, any browser that has app cache has everything else we care about. So.
We know that this is going to be a somewhat modern browser that supports app cache, and we can ask for a few extra files that may or may not be relevant in the meantime to simplify things. Long term, we thought about defining something in the cookie based on the results of tests and sniffing or looking at that on the server while rendering the manifest to see exactly what files you need. But if Dan adds a new video JS to the whole site or a new ad JS, we have to update this manifest manually right now. We could try to build something that uses an admin or a database to pull the relevant values, or parse something out of load controller. We just haven't gotten around to that yet.
And fun little cautionary example of living on the bleeding edge of HTML5. So back in May, people that are working on the app cache spec finally realized that allowing people to cache something that had a 302 status code, which is a redirect, was not a good idea. So they said back in May, okay, if a 302, one of these resources returns a 302, then just die. Break the cache right then. And so that was all well and good. It's hidden, buried somewhere in the spec. And about a month and a half ago, suddenly the app cache stopped working on a few WebKit browsers in mobile. And then a few days later, it stopped working on a few more WebKit browsers. And then a few days later, I found myself looking at WebKit C++ source code, commit messages to figure out, oh, at this version, they finally implemented that, and now Chrome is running with this now. Safari isn't yet. So if you do use local storage, app cache, any of the new technologies, there's going to be moments like that that are just going to happen. But you'll learn a lot, too.
Or you can wait till 2020 when the spec is done. Either way.
Yeah, I'm still waiting till 2025 before I even touch SOAP again.
So the result of this having app cache and local storage is that kind of disconnect you without any problems.
I don't know.
Oh, we're basically going to wrap this up then. Yeah. So you load the page and no internet connection. The page still loads, the JavaScript is still running. You can still read the articles. This whole page is being built with JavaScript. So the page is rendered server-side as well, so that it works with no JavaScript. But whatever's in local storage will trump whatever's on the server-side rendered page if there's more updates. So if you have there's so many different combinations of what can happen, but if you have a saved version in the cache manifest that hasn't been invalidated by the timestamp, but you've gone to another page or used another device to save an article, then you will have updated content in your local storage, which will update this also that you don't see an article and say, hey, I read that already, and that would be awful.
And if you're on a BlackBerry 4, it's a glorified link list of every article you've saved.
Right, so the content is Ajaxed in, but that just won't happen if you don't have the JavaScript, so you'll just get these nice previews.
Which are regular old normal links.
It's another example of progressive enhancement.
Oh, this is the real. Oh, that's right, map keyboard. All right, and what's the big screen button?
Apple Shift.
Apple Shift. And with that, ta-da!
Thanks.
Mine's probably a very simple question. I was just looking at the CSS on that, and there are different, you have header, footer, navs and stuff like that, but then you had another one, it was called GlobeStaff.css.
GlobeStaff.css?
Oh yeah, that's CSS specific for the Globe staff page.
Staff and bio
Oh, there's
page.
a staff page.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's a staff and bio page that is pretty different that should only get that asset when you're on that page.
You might want to go online too.
I thought it was some kind of test.
Yeah, let's
So I bet that's a bug then, because we probably don't need
The
that.
very last one.
Yeah.
Yeah, GlobeStaff.
So
No, you do need it. Remember we ran into it where we had to add that or something. That was very vague.
yeah, we could probably refactor the CSS and remove that dependency, and then we wouldn't need to add it on this page. But yeah, that's exactly what having separate files and concatenating them is supposed to prevent, right? So at least here it's clear that that CSS, like, hey, why are we loading staff CSS on this page, right? It doesn't make sense. So glad you caught that.
And repeat after me, single point of truth.
No, but I also found it interesting how you broke up your CSS.
Oh yeah, it's concatenated together the way the JS is as well.
It also makes it much easier to manage than if you have one file with all of that CSS in it, especially with a content management system that has some version control issues.
Lack of version control.
Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask, it doesn't say images.
It does save images.
It does save images.
Yeah, so you see all these PNGs here. They're being downloaded and saved in the application cache. That's exactly what the cache is
Or
for.
do you mean story images?
Oh, story images?
Yeah.
No, app cache and local storage together on most devices get to fight over about 5 megabytes of space. So that's one big request from the editorial departments of the world, and thankfully because the editorial departments of the world are now requesting this, they're kind of reevaluating. Some devices are letting you increase local storage size. You can decrease images by kind of writing them out.
Well, I was also wondering if the advertising department is asking about it as well.
So
Yeah.
with my saved, let's see, do we have ads on here now?
No, we don't. We got a special blanket exemption because
in some of the prototypes, we were just thinking of having like a single sponsorship that didn't rotate, per page view, but it was like per month or something like that, and a few like premium sponsors. So in that case, kind of like that JetBlue ad that Dan showed, we can custom tailor it and add it to the cache manifest and all of that, so that you can still see it offline. And
So do you have that capability?
sure, we would just add it to the application cache as one additional asset and render it and just have it on the page, just like the red star next to my saved and all the other images, just another image.
So then my second question is, are you tracking it all? Save how many articles are saved, percentage of visitors who are saving, et cetera, et cetera?
We are tracking a bunch of it, but we haven't done much analysis on the data per se yet. We have the data, we are tracking it, but I think our web analytics team is more concerned right now with just figuring out what people are doing with the site as a whole. And also there's certain data you don't quite get, like for example, how do you track a user's viewing habits when they're reading offline kind of stuff. So there's that. But yeah, we are, and this is also kind of an experiment. I mean, it's a production-ready system, so I wouldn't call it beta, but it is, at least the idea behind it is kind of a beta idea in moving towards a more personalized newspaper website. So it's going to grow and expand, and it might not even be like this, within the year. It might be completely different.
This is a very primitive kind of playlist of your news, and you could imagine you subscribing to genres or saving whole sections or authors, and there's a lot of personalization that can come from this, and analyzing what you've saved and said, hey, you've saved this, maybe you want to read this. So these are all things that
Or
people are talking about.
automatic saving, like you want to save a columns, so all you have to do is log on to the
Yep.
site and do it automatically.
That was one of the first
Exactly.
things brought up was the, can we subscribe to Dan Shaughnessy?
And a big use case of this is like your morning commute on the train where you don't have internet or something. So you can imagine that if you just visit the site once in the morning, you get all that content downloaded, saved for offline reading, and then at some later point you can access it out and it automatically updates that.
And on our end, it was also a big experiment for designing some kind of way of creating applications with our new content management system that couldn't be built entirely inside the content management system.
Do you know if anybody really makes use of the cached version of My Saved List? Because app cache sounds like a great idea, but I always wonder about discoverability. Like how do I know that I can go to My Saved?
So, when you first come here and you have not flipped the bit on the server that hides this, you get this. And this at least explains it all to you. We closed it, and then once you toggle it once.
And there was a ton of copy in like the advertisements and stuff about offline reading experience.
I just set it up for the very first time, and the one thing that I didn't realize was that Firefox was asking me if it was okay.
Oh, the app cache?
I was about to tell you it's broken, it's not working until I realized that Firefox asked for allow. So is that the only browser that asks for allow?
No. Some browsers will actually, when you get up to your 5 megabyte storage limit, ask you if you want to increase the storage. Some will just do it for you without asking. It depends on the browsers. They're supposed to kind of ask you,
But tracking offline use is something that we would like to do, and it's a bit complicated. Like we have tracking pixels and stuff on this page for online
You could
use
JavaScript detect and then stuff in local storage.
Yeah,
That they
we
were
thought
offline,
about,
but
like,
then somebody could go look
buffering.
in local storage and say, oh, I can make it look like 8 million people looked at this website, So
Yeah, so it's fun for your analytics team.
that's what I say too.
Yeah.
I think, Omniture and Google Analytics haven't developed features for that, so that's a bit telling that,
I'm gonna just do it.
It's an emerging market.
Yeah, hey, got a company. Yep.
So you mentioned testing, every device. So there are other, through MySaver or the main site, are there other kind of unique QA testing things that came up, or methods, approaches, processes that came out of this whole, evolved out of this whole?
Yeah.
Covers to every mobile device one at a time.
So our creative technologist, Chris Marstall, created something called Shim, which lets you synchronize multiple devices. So I have all these devices, phones and laptops and various browsers, listening to the same server, and when I go to a page on one of them, all the others go to the same page. Things like that, or having just a table of devices for us to test on have helped with this process, and also everyone has their own personal phone that they're checking it on, and that captures a lot.
Damon was here earlier.
Yeah, emulators and simulators are cool, but they don't tell the truth.
They lie.
Oh yeah,
They
that
lie.
actually, that's a good point. We initially were looking at emulators to get all the different versions of Android and iOS, and it was working in the emulators and it wasn't working on people's phones. So we quickly stopped doing that and would find the phone and had a bunch of devices, purchased a bunch of devices from Kindle to now the Fire and
yeah. Damon, who was here earlier, is in
iPhones.
charge of our mobile. He's our mobile product manager, so he did a lot of mobile testing as well. And yeah, there's interesting things you run into with mobile. Like I didn't know, but I guess they do cache content from really big websites. So sometimes you find like, oh, it's running JavaScript that we replaced yesterday still, kind of stuff. It's a little surprising.
All right, well, thank you very much.